Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation. As Director of Lectures and Seminars, it's my privilege to welcome everyone to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website, as well as those who will be seeing us on a future occasion on C-SPAN Book TV. We would ask everyone in-house to check that cell phones have been turned off. And for those viewing us online, questions or comments can be submitted at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Heather Sexton. Ms. Sexton serves as director of our Young Leaders Program. She oversees Heritage's youth outreach efforts to the next generation of political activists, grassroots leaders, and public policy professionals. Among the programs under her oversight are our internship program, campus outreach activities, student group briefings, and our Young Leaders Program virtual think tank webcasts. Before serving as director of this program, she was our intern coordinator, as well as having served as a Heritage intern herself. A graduate of the University of Michigan, get that clear, the University of Michigan. She earned her bachelor's degree in English and political science. Please join me in welcoming Heather Sexton. Heather?
Thank you, John. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Paul Kengor for you today, Professor of Political Science at Grove City College and Executive Director of the Center for Vision and Values, a Grove City think tank policy center which focuses on advancing freedom with Christian scholarship. Paul is also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. He's a frequent contributor to MSNBC, C-SPAN, and Fox News. In addition, he has written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Political Science Quarterly, and many other publications. Among the numerous books he has authored are The Crusader, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of Communism, God and Ronald Reagan, God and George W. Bush, and William P. Clark, Ronald Reagan's Top Hand. Today, I am excited that Paul will be focusing on his newly released book, Dupes, How America's Adversaries Have Manipulated Progressives for a Century. We are really looking forward to hear your discussion of this troubling aspect of history, the prominent role of the dupe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Kengor.
Thank you, Heather, John, and everybody here at Heritage, everybody for coming. Lee Edwards, I see him here. I really struggled with how to organize this talk because I turned in a manuscript of 250,000 words and about 1,000 pages, and I think the book God and Ronald Reagan, I believe, was somewhere around 100,000 words. So that gives you an idea of just how enormous the task was, and probably as well just how many dupes are out there. In fact, I'm not joking when I say this could be volume 1 in a multi-volume set. I really didn't know where to stop, and there were a number of people at different points that I thought I'd have full chapters on, and there turned out to be so much information I'd fill up an entire box that I would just mark, for example, Henry Wallace, and then at some point I got a punt on this one. I mean, I could do a whole book just on this guy. So I'm going to focus a little bit with, first I'm going to give you a little overview as to why I did this, why I chose this subject, my goal, hopefully the importance of the issue, and then work upwards chronologically through 3 cases that I think are very telling and represent different types of individuals. An academic, somebody involved in education, a writer, and also a politician. And specifically, I'll talk about John Dewey, Frank Marshall Davis, and Ted Kennedy as examples. And during the Q&A, there's a lot of other people that we could talk about as well, including actors, all kinds of people in Hollywood. Humphrey Bogart, for example, who I talk about in the book as a dupe. But there was also, as you'll note in the appendix of the book, I found a Bogart in the Communist Party USA archives from the Soviet Comintern, and I look at that very carefully as to whether that could possibly be Humphrey Bogart. So that's something that we could also talk about during the Q&A. But first, on why I did this, 3 components: scholarship, partisanship, and the issue of redemption. Scholarship, I noticed that nobody had ever done a book on the role of dupes in American history. And in fact, did a Google search on the term, and maybe 2 or 3 books in all the Library of Congress even have the word in the title. And yet, it's a word that goes back to the founding of the Republic itself. You'd probably be surprised to know that George Washington used the word dupes in his farewell address. So they've been warning about it since the founding of the Republic. Adam Smith, who was not an American, but of course was around at the time of the founding, he was a pen pal with Ben Franklin. Adam Smith, in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, talks about dupes. But then suddenly it took an ugly upsurge with the founding of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the launching of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in October 1917. And then after that, even more specifically, with the founding of the Comintern, the Communist International, in Moscow in March of 1919. If you're following this chronologically, then it gets really bad with the founding of the Communist Party in America in Chicago in September of 1919. And as I was looking in one particular cache of documents in particular, the Comintern archives on CPUSA, which are right over here at the Library of Congress. I mean, there's hundreds of reels of microfiche. And by the way, when I would go there in the summertime when professors and academics are off, I mean, not like we work a lot to begin with during the school year, but I never once, even one time, was told by an archivist, oh, you can't have that reel because somebody else has it out. Hardly anyone's even looking at this stuff. And that's because most academic historians are on the left. And when you see what these files say, they are a real indictment of many things that the left has believed. Among them, I started going through, started spinning the different reels of microfiche, and one of the first documents that you come to is a September 1919 document from the Communist Party of America in its founding on Blue Island Avenue in Chicago, Illinois. I have a bunch of different documents. I could have done PowerPoint, but as some of my former students in here know, I'm technically computer illiterate, so I didn't bother with that. But I'll hold these up, and they're in the book. I'll try to describe them. But this one right here, Communist Party of America, it looks like this on microfiche. It's actually a good reproduction. These are 100-year-old documents. But this is from Charles Ruthenberg, the executive secretary, and it's very brief. He's sending it to the folks at the Communist International in Moscow. In the name of the Communist Workers of the United States, organized in the Communist Party of America, I extend greetings to the Communist Party of Russia. Hail to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Long live the Russian Socialist Soviet republics. Long live the Communist International. Fraternally yours, Executive Secretary Charles Ruthenberg, who today is buried in the wall of the Kremlin. But as you see these right off, you learn what the American government learned and what anti-communists said throughout the 20th century, that the American Communist Party was not just another political party. I mean, they were loyal Soviet patriots. They were dedicated to the Soviet Union. Their materials ended up in the Communist International files in Moscow. And we only have them now because they were declassified by the Yeltsin government in the early 1990s. So you see here right off, and this is why I think scholars on the left are ignoring this stuff. What the anti-communists said all along was right? There was this tight bond, this inseparable bond between the American Party and the Soviet Party. Another document, this is from, again, Chicago, where the party was founded. This one is from November 24th, 1919. And it says, to the Bureau of the Communist International. Okay? As International Secretary, again, Charles Ruthenberg of the American Party, I make application for admission of the Communist Party of America to the Bureau of the Communist International. They're filing their formal membership application in this. It's a 3-page document, and you get to the very end, last page, just a few lines, and it says here, the final struggle of the communist proletariat will be waged in the United States. Our conquest of power alone assuring the world Soviet Republic. Realizing all this, the Communist Party prepares for the struggle. Long live the Communist International, long live the World Revolution. Fraternally yours, International Secretary Charles Ruthenberg. Once again, you see that connection. Why are dupes so important in this? Dupes are so critical because dupes were people on the progressive left, liberal left, who weren't communists themselves, but sometimes ran in the same circles, had some of the same ideas, shared some of the same sympathies, redistribution of wealth, workers' rights, nationalizations, right? Different issues. They weren't as far to the left as the communists, but over a little bit. And I started finding throughout these files clear evidence, letter after letter, document after document, where the boys at the Comintern in Moscow and the boys at CPUSA headquarters in New York or Chicago or wherever are very closely laying out plans and campaigns to try to very deliberately dupe progressives and liberals. Go to this rally, do this. Don't let them know that you're a communist. If you're charged with being a communist, say it's red-baiting paranoia, right? Later on in the 1950s, call it McCarthyism, right? Deny that you're an actual communist. And they would go to these rallies and they would do that, and the progressives would do precisely, they'd say, we're not communists, and the progressives and liberals would say, they're not communists. Then the anti-communists would come in and say, yes, they are, I know they are, and then the anti-communists would be the bad guy. They'd be the red-baiting reprobates, the paranoid anti-communist troglodytes and cavemen. So the dupes were critical. The American Communist Party at its peak membership in the 1930s only got to be about 100,000 members. So they could never really get any popular support. To try to get larger popular support for their cause, they had to enlist progressives and liberals. So that's why I looked at this. They targeted the progressive liberal left, but, and this gets to an important point I want to make on partisanship, they didn't always have success. And I appreciate the chance to say this to a conservative audience in particular. There were a lot of good anti-communist liberals and anti-communist Democrats who weren't duped. Okay, and I've got dozens and dozens of examples. Arthur Schlesinger, the late Arthur Schlesinger Jr., wrote a piece for Life magazine in 1946, which at that point was, along with Time, probably the largest circulation in all of America. And Schlesinger said this: communists have succeeded in hiding their true face from American liberals. The Reds are posing a most serious danger to liberals. They are engaged in a massive attack on the moral fabric of the American left, unquote. George F. Kennan said the same kind of thing, trying to warn people on the left, don't be duped by these guys. Don't be taken in. The list of one-time dupe liberals who changed, who learned, who were duped once, said, boy, was I duped, and then changed and weren't duped again. Humphrey Bogart, Eleanor Roosevelt, William Bullitt, Paul Douglas, John Dewey. From Hollywood, Lucille Ball, Jimmy Cagney, Olivia de Havilland. Olivia de Havilland played Melanie on Gone with the Wind, right? Jimmy Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, Melvin Douglas, and also a later anti-communist crusader, conservative Republican president named Ronald Reagan, who admitted in 1946 that he had been misled, that he had been duped as well. Democrats, on the other hand, there were anti-communist Democrats and liberals from the very beginning who I think were never duped and right away recognized the danger that the communists posed to their plans and their policies. And I'm going to surprise you here. The first president who had to deal with this at the founding of the party, founding of the American Communist Party, was who? 1919? 1920, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson may have been the progressive's progressive and a man of the left, all right, but he was an anti-communist and he was stridently anti-Bolshevik. Described the Bolsheviks as barbarians, tyrants, and terrorists. Exact words that Wilson used. Harry Truman, same kind of thing. JFK warned us about our atheistic foe and the godless communist conspiracy. They realized, these guys did, that the communists were not their friends and went after the causes that they held dear. They attacked Wilson's League of Nations. They attacked FDR's New Deal. The documents in the archives on this are stunning. Almost as if the boys at CPUSA wanted to report to the boys back in Moscow the yeoman's work that they were doing attacking liberal causes. And here's one This is the 1920 presidential election. This is from the United Communist Party. Don't vote, strike, boycott this election. Overthrow the capitalist government, establish the Soviet government. Not just another political party, right? Not just another political party. When you strike, the court enjoins you, the police beat you, the soldiers shoot you. That is what the capitalist government is for. The United Communist Party is the only party which puts up candidates for this purpose. Boycott this election. Don't vote. Strike. An official proclamation from the United Communist Party: stand by Soviet Russia. Another: boycott the election. Right? Here's Communist Labor, put out by the Communist Labor Party of America. This is February 1920. Guess who was on the front? Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, who they're portraying as an Indian carrying a scalp. Okay? That's what they thought of the progressives. Liberals. Okay? The communists were not your friends. Quit defending these guys. The anti-communists were right. Here they are in 1933, May Day, protesting the Roosevelt administration. Okay, putting together a march. Demonstrate against hunger, fascism, and war. The New Deal is a blow against the workers and increases profits for Wall Street. All this was done as a capitalist way out of the crisis. All this shows how the American government, this is the Roosevelt administration, is moving headlong towards fascism and war. Roosevelt, fascist. Okay, that's the American Communist Party. Here's another one, May Day, same period. They did this all over the country in 1933. Condemning the Roosevelt's program of, quote, forced labor for the unemployed, unquote. And who had the answer? Lenin, right? Lenin shows the way, right? Lenin shows the South the only way to jobs, land, and freedom. So that's what they were sending around. That's the kind of thing that they were doing. And while they're doing all of that, they're also very contemptuously, very carefully, very strategically trying to get progressives and liberals to join their cause. So I'll give you three cases, three examples. John Dewey. John Dewey I include among a group that I call Potemkin progressives. And these were people in the 1920s and 1930s, American progressives, Western progressives, British as well as American, who were taken to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s and very carefully manipulated by Soviet handlers. It's extraordinary to see how they did this. It's shocking. It's shocking. And it's shocking to see how many took the bait as well. And because the Woodrow Wilson administration wouldn't recognize the Bolsheviks, because the early British government wouldn't recognize the Bolsheviks, Winston Churchill had told Lloyd George, you might as well legalize sodomy before recognize the Bolsheviks. The progressives were upset by that in the 20s. So Stalin and the boys, late 1920s, started bringing American and Western progressives to the Soviet Union to take them on carefully managed tours to try to get them to go back to the United States, write articles about how great the Soviet Union is, how they're finding this whole new world. Oh, and by the way, the United States government ought to recognize the Soviet government. So these were the Potemkin progressives. One of them, H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, after a meeting with Stalin in 1934, I've never met a man more candid, fair, and honest. Everyone trusts him. Everyone trusts him. That's the start of the Great Terror, 1934. Well, maybe it was just Stalin. Wells likewise had been impressed by Vladimir Lenin, who he called, quote, a frank, refreshing, and amazing little man. Amazing little man. Wells' fellow socialist, George Bernard Shaw, met with Stalin, and you're going to think this is sarcastic. It's not. He's completely serious. George Bernard Shaw. We cannot afford to give ourselves moral airs when our most enterprising neighbor, the Soviet Union, humanely and judiciously liquidates a handful of exploiters and speculators to make the world safe for honest men. And if you see the actual original notes from the meeting, which Lady Astor and some other people recorded, that was precisely what Stalin had told George Bernard Shaw. He parroted the exact line that Stalin wanted him to say. Somebody who wasn't taken by this but was a witness was the great Malcolm Muggeridge. And Muggeridge, upon one of his returns, made these comments about what he saw, talking about these American progressives. They are unquestionably one of the wonders of the age, and I shall treasure till I die as a blessed memory the spectacle of them traveling with radiant optimism through a famished countryside, wandering in happy bands about squalid, overcrowded Soviet towns, listening with unshakable faith to the fatuous patter of carefully trained and indoctrinated guides, repeating like school children a multiplication table, the bogus statistics and mindless slogans endlessly intoned to them. Muggeridge continued, there were earnest advocates of the humane killing of cattle who looked up at the massive headquarters of the OGPU with tears of gratitude in their eyes. Earnest advocates of proportional representation who eagerly assented with the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat was explained to them. Get this one. There were earnest clergymen who walked reverently through Soviet anti-God museums and reverently turned the pages of atheistic literature. Earnest pacifists who watched delightedly tanks rattle across Red Square and bombing planes darken the sky. Earnest town planning specialists who stood outside overcrowded ramshackle tenements and muttered, if only we had something like this in England. Not only was Muggeridge mystified but by the naivete that he saw among these progressives, but so were the Soviets. Muggeridge said, the almost unbelievable credulity of these mostly university-educated tourists astonished even Soviet officials that were used to handling foreign visitors. In the book, I quote Ion Pasipa, who was a Romanian and an intelligence chief during the Cold War. Yuri Bezmenov, who died a few years ago, who talks about handling Western visitors like Senator Ted Kennedy. And Bezmenov, who worked for Novosti, the Soviet press agency, said, among my duties was to get these Western progressives, and from the moment that they got off the plane at Moscow International Airport, among my chief tasks was to keep them permanently intoxicated the entire time that they were in the Soviet Union. And a lot of these guys, Pasipa, Bezmenov, they came to see the rot of the Soviet system, and it disturbed them, and it ate at their conscience because they thought, here's what I'm working for, but what do I do? How do I defect? How do I get out of here? How do I take care of my family? And they were depressed at how progressives would come to the country, and no matter how outrageous the line of exaggeration and propaganda they fed them, they swallowed it again and again and again and again. Muggeridge, these fellow passengers provided my first experience of the progressive elite from all over the world who attached themselves to the Soviet regime, resolved to believe anything that they were told by the spokesman. Resolved to believe anything that they were told. One of them was John Dewey. A founder of American public education, and probably the single greatest influence on American public schools to this day, whose books have been used for about 100 years now to train generation after generation of public school teachers. Columbia Teachers College, departments of education, teachers' colleges all over the country. This guy's books are like sacred scripture in some departments of education. Dewey, did you know this? I didn't know this until I started reading. I never learned any of this when I had to learn about Dewey. Dewey's books were being rapidly translated into Russian by the Bolsheviks as early as 1918. The Bolsheviks had taken over in October 1917. You immediately get a vicious civil war in Russia from 1918 to 1921. W. Bruce Lincoln, the Russian historian, said 7 million men, women, and children died in that war. Bolsheviks are completely broke, they're completely preoccupied, but they realized how important John Dewey's works were to the Soviet collective communist state that they were trying to put in place. So they immediately started translating them. 1918, Dewey's Schools of Tomorrow, published in Russian. 1919, Dewey's How We Think, published in Russian. 1920, Dewey, The School and Society, published in Russian. Dewey's preeminent classic, what is it? 1921, Democracy and Education. Democracy and Education. 1921, published as a 62-page pamphlet. That book, as a Dewey biographer said, became a Bible of Columbia Teachers College, and the Soviets loved it and adored it. Now, do you think Dewey, perhaps, once he caught wind of this, that Lenin and Grigory Zinoviev and all these others, probably felt bad that the architects of this collectivist totalitarian society adored his books and were translated into Russian? No, he was flattered. He was flattered. Sort of mutual admiration society started developing between Dewey and the Bolshevik hierarchy. And so, in the summer of 1928, John Dewey, along with 25 American educators from various universities, made a trip to the Soviet Union, where they were given the full Potemkin village treatment. All the factories, ride around in Lincoln limousines, caviar, all the food, everything you could possibly imagine. Dewey went there realizing, too, the possibility that they were going to try to manipulate him. In fact, he even says, the warning that appears humorous in retrospect, so often given by kindly friends, the warning that I would be fooled by being taken to show places. Right? That's not going to possibly happen. So when Dewey came back, he wrote a 6-part series for the New Republic. The Bible, political Bible of the American left for a long time. Published from November 14th, 1928 through December 19th, 1928. I have a long chapter on this in the book, so I won't read all the quotes, but it is astonishing to read these articles. It is really astonishing. Dewey, my mind was in a whirl. Readjustment was difficult. I lived somewhat dazed. The liberation of the people that I saw. The outstanding fact is that Russia is in a revolution involving a release of human powers on such an unprecedented scale that it is of incalculable significance not only for this country, but for the whole world. In one really painful article, Dewey writes about how impressed he was with the restoration of Russian churches that was taking place under Lenin and Stalin. They were blowing them up. In a later biography of Dewey, where that's mentioned, the biographer, who is completely sympathetic, loves Dewey, inserts this general little footnote right there. It says something like, apparently Professor Dewey didn't know about the demolishing of Russian churches that was going on in Russia at the time. How? How did he didn't know that? I mean, that's what they were doing. They're blowing them up. 657 churches operating in Moscow on the eve of the revolution. 46 left by the 1970s, official Soviet statistics. How could he not know this? Dewey, this one, I'm not making it up. The Bolsheviks, right? How they're doing things. Well, in spite of secret police, inquisitions, arrest and deportation of netmen and kulaks, businessmen, industrialists, and farmers, aside from exiling of party opponents, this is Dewey's own writing, including divergent elements in the party, life for the masses goes on with regularity, safety, and decorum, aside from all those other things. The external routine of life is more settled and secure in Russia than in probably any other country in all of Europe. And this isn't what I'm being told, he said, it's what I'm seeing. The Bolshevik Revolution, he pronounced, was a great success, a great success. And I think the schools are a dialectic factor in the evolution of Russian communism. His very last article for the New Republic, Dewey wrote this: political recognition of Russia on the part of the United States is at least a necessary antecedent step, bringing about the kind of relations that are in the interest of both countries and of the world. I went to Russia with no conviction on that subject, but now here I am telling you, I think our government should recognize Bolshevik Russia, which was precisely the #1 priority of what Stalin and the Bolsheviks wanted in bringing these progressives over, that they would go back home and call for recognition. So that's Dewey. I'll give you a couple of other examples here. Frank Marshall Davis, the example of Frank Marshall Davis. I spent about 4 years on this one, and I won't take you through the entire 4-year sojourn, I promise you. But Frank Marshall Davis is relevant right now because he was, I'm choosing my words carefully, a mentor to the current President of the United States, Barack Obama. That was in Obama's years in the latter 1970s in Hawaii. And I first started reading about Frank Marshall Davis and Obama in 2007, 2008. I heard conservatives on talk radio, on blogs, and elsewhere saying Frank Marshall Davis is a communist. He was a Communist Party member. You know, take it to the bank. This guy's a communist. He influenced Obama. And meanwhile, while I'm hearing all of this stuff, I have spread all over my desk all these committee reports, right? Senate Judiciary Committee, run by Democrats, by the way. House Committee on Internal Security, run by Democrats. House Committee on American Activities, almost always run by Democrats. Most of the people who ran these committees were Democrats, you guys. Chris Dodd's father, Thomas Dodd, right? Francis Walter, Representative Icord. Jack Kennedy was an anti-communist on some of these committees. So I hear this and I'm thinking, okay, what does he really believe? What does Davis really believe? And how close was he to Obama? August 2nd, 2008, AP piece. Davis was a constant figure in Obama's early life. He was an important influence who Obama looked to like a father, a mentor for advice on living, other things. Obama, in Dreams from My Father. I was intrigued by old Frank, with his books and whiskey breath and the hint of hard-earned knowledge behind the hooded eyes. Right, behind the hooded eyes. Frank gave me advice on college, on women, on life. All these different examples. So I started looking in the different documents, and among the things that I found, there's a night, Frank Marshall Davis was called to testify before the Senate in 1956 for communist associations. He pleaded the Fifth Amendment. These are in the book. I give the actual copies of the actual pages. I think it's around page 256, 257 in the book. Pleaded the Fifth Amendment. Next year in 1957, a Senate report actually listed Frank Marshall Davis as an identified member of Communist Party USA. So that's pretty, Congress didn't just go and say that somebody was a member of the Communist Party. They would say things like, this person has associations with communist front groups. Here they actually said he was a member of Communist Party USA. So I started looking at some different biographers. John Edgar Tidwell, who's the preeminent biographer on Frank Marshall Davis. James Edward Smethurst, who's a Davis biographer. Most of these guys are on the left. Smethurst, University of Massachusetts professor, Harvard PhD. Smethurst said Davis was almost certainly a party member. I read John Edgar Tidwell's book. He's a University of Kansas professor. In that book, Tidwell said Davis actually joined the Communist Party and produces a letter that he dates around 1943, where Davis says in his own writing that he joined the Communist Party. Okay. Finally, after looking at all of those different things, not long before the book went to press, I got Davis's actual FBI file, which was declassified through a FOIA request by a fellow researcher. It's about 600 pages long. And as soon as you start reading Frank Marshall Davis's FBI file, you can see there very clearly, it takes maybe a half an hour of reading to see that the guy was a communist. Very, very, very clear. And in the appendix of the book, I give 10 to 12 pages from that FBI file, including on page 507, this page, which, among other information, actually lists Frank Marshall Davis's Communist Party card number 47544, which is, I mean, that's hard evidence. I recently read some of the stuff that was out there accusing Howard Zinn of being a party member. Howard Zinn's file was recently released, and I read the FBI file. There aren't things like Communist Party numbers in Zinn's file. All right, when you find a file that has CP numbers, you've really got something. And by the way, those numbers are fully consistent with other people who joined the party at the time. including Hollywood 10 members who you're probably being told at your universities were all innocent lambs, just, liberals and progressives practicing their civil liberties, dragged before Joe McCarthy. They weren't dragged before. Joe McCarthy was a senator. He wasn't on the House Committee on American Activities. October 1947, called to Washington, D.C. to testify. John Howard Lawson was one of the Hollywood 10. Communist Party card number 47275. Albert Maltz, 47196. Alva Bessie, 46836. I got I got all of Frank Marshall Davis's columns, weekly columns that he wrote for the Honolulu Record for 1949 and 1950, which was the Communist Party USA organ in Hawaii. And I got them through the help of two tremendous Grove City College students. One found them online, and the other, who's actually in Hawaii, and I'm amazed is here today. I'll keep it secret, I promise. But she went into a library at the University of Hawaii and got the columns on microfiche, actual hard copy. But what you see here in reading Davis's columns was just how anti-American the Communist Party was in the United States in the latter 1940s. Who was president of the United States after World War II? Harry Truman. What party? Democrat. So he was the enemy. So they mercilessly savaged Harry Truman. Davis just took him apart. Davis turned Harry Truman into a demon in these articles. Colonialist, imperialist, fascist, racist monsters were Truman, George Marshall, you name it. Examples. February 9th, 1950 piece. Here Davis really toes the Soviet and the Communist Party line of portraying Harry Truman as the butcher of Hiroshima. By the way, Harry Truman dropped the bomb on Japan August 6th and 9th, 1945 to spare a land invasion of Japan. The land invasion would have been joined by who? Not just American troops, not just British troops, but Russian troops. Stalin supported this. But once the war is over, truth doesn't matter, right? Lenin, the only truth that matters, there is no truth. The only morality that matters is that which furthers class interests. So after the war, Truman, who had done what we wanted in August 1945, is now the butcher of Hiroshima. And that becomes the CP-USA line, that becomes the Moscow line everywhere. Here's Davis's columns. We got actual pictures of them, page 256, 257. This one from February 9th, 1950. When we dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima, said Davis, we believed the world was ours. Having defeated the Axis powers on the battlefront, we were now ready to show the Russians who was the boss of the world. Unquote. Said Harry Truman's goal was to rule Russia. In addition to that, the accused Truman and the Democrats in particular of wanting to turn West Germany back to the Nazis. The Marshall Plan was a sham. A policy to try to, as Davis put it, re-enslave, the colonial peoples around the world, the black and yellow peoples around the world, as he wrote in this piece. That was the goal of the Marshall Plan, not to bail out Western Europe, but to re-enslave the world. And if you've ever studied this period, you know that the only people making that argument anywhere in the world, Stalin and Molotov, and CP-USA. Quote, Davis, the big industrialists who financed Hitler have been handed back their factories, and the old school ties with Wall Street are almost as strong as they ever were. America's policy of denazification is a sham, one of the big jokes of the 20th century. What kind of West Germany is America trying to help back to its feet? Wrote Frank Marshall Davis. It is the Germany of the master race theory. The fascists that we sought to exterminate in World War II as the greatest threat to mankind the globe has ever known are now our partners. What do you say we kiss and make up? As I was reading that column at the time, Senator Obama had gone to Berlin, he was still senator, and made this eloquent speech about how Americans and Germans stood together in those days of the Berlin blockade and after World War II and the Marshall Plan to resist the Soviet Union. Well, not all Americans did. Frank Marshall Davis was on the other side on that. Another piece that continues to haunt me, January 26, 1950 column by Davis called Free Enterprise or Socialism. And in this piece, Davis's demon is not Harry Truman, right? Not the Democrats, but General Motors, GM. And Davis is furious that this gigantic corporation called GM made a profit last year of $600 million. And he's trying to frame GM as an aggressive monopoly. Davis concludes, in the face of still rising unemployment and a mounting depression, the time draws nearer when we will have to decide to oust the monopolies and restore a system of competing free enterprise, or let the government own and operate our major industries. If Davis could have, if he could have, he would have nationalized GM in 1950, no question. How relevant is all of this today with President Obama? I mean, we can go into all that, we could talk about that in the Q&A. I started looking at Davis and reading these columns. I went a little bit, not exactly the order of my discovery of these things. I read the columns first, and then I started finding the FBI files and the other things. But at first I thought with Davis that I was dealing with possibly a progressive liberal who was duped by communists, and then I realized that this was a communist who duped progressives and liberals. And so I realized I had to have this character in the book. Now, how exactly relevant is it to today and what's going on in Washington? How does it apply to today? I mean, we could talk about that. We can debate that. You could make some of those conclusions. I don't go into all of that, but I cover Davis obviously at length. One last example here, and then I'll wrap up and take your questions. Senator Ted Kennedy, the late Senator Ted Kennedy, who's hard to get a handle on, and I've been asked if I consider Kennedy a dupe or something else altogether. I found things from Kennedy on the Vietnam War in the 1960s that he said about our troops. They were almost identical to things that he was saying about the troops in 2003, 2004, 2005 in the Middle East. It was really startling. I didn't realize all the things that Kennedy had said about our troops in Vietnam, for example, in the 1960s. But the major revelation that I have on Kennedy, which I know a lot of you are familiar with, is a May 1983 document that's in the Central Committee archives in the Soviet Union. And my understanding is that the archives have since been resealed. And so you can't go in now and get that document. But that's okay, I've got it, and it's in the book so you can read it. So I've won up the Russians. I'm all excited about that. But here is the actual document, which is in the appendix in the book. It's 5 pages in Russian. So if any of you read Russian, by the way, I've been told that the translation that's in the book by Marco Suprin is actually pretty kind to Kennedy. It's kind of charitable that if you actually read it in Russian, you could, it's worse, yeah, both in Russian. And then here it is, it's in English also. And on the very back of the book, there's the very top of page 1, translated in English is listed there. But here's what this document says. Does this not grab you right away? Special importance, Committee on State Security of the USSR, KGB, May 14th, 1983. And then this subject head is bound to pique your curiosity. Regarding Senator Kennedy's request to the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Y.V. Andropov. Okay. Opening line. On 9/10 May of this year, this is 1983, President Reagan, right? Reagan is president. SDI speech, March of 1983. Evil Empire speech, March of 1983. Re-election campaign coming up in 1984. On 9/10 May of this year, Senator Edward Kennedy's close friend and trusted confidant, and they note who this was in Moscow. The senator charged him to convey the following message through confidential contacts. to the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Y. Andropov. Senator Kennedy, like other rational people, is very troubled by the current state of Soviet-American relations. Events are developing such as this relationship, coupled with a general state of global affairs, will make the situation even more dangerous. Here we go. The main reason for this is Reagan's belligerence and his firm commitment to deploy new American middle-range nuclear weapons within Western Europe. He goes through here in this document and lists different reasons as to why exactly Reagan is gaining in popularity. And by the way, this is fascinating. Here you have an admission from the Soviet head of the KGB, Viktor Chebrakov, who's really interpreting the offer from Senator Kennedy, so an admission from him as well, that Reaganomics is working, right? It's in a private letter. You know, Reaganomics is working, the economy's doing terrific. Reagan's really popular, he's cruising the easy re-election. Oh no, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do about this? Well, they go through there, and then it says, you know, given the current state of affairs, basically, Reagan's re-election coming up, what can we do? What can we do to stop this, to reverse Reagan's belligerent and dangerous defense policies? Well, then they get to the core of the offer. Kennedy proposes the following, and they give 1, 2, 3 different steps here, but basically what Kennedy believed, according to this document, okay, what Kennedy believed is that the Soviets wanted peace, and this increasing in Cold War tensions was the fault of Reagan. And the Soviets needed help in better communicating their peaceful intentions to the American media and to Americans generally. Because as this letter says, hilariously, Reagan was good at propaganda. So you need to figure out a way to get around Reagan's smokescreen of propaganda. So how do you better communicate directly to the American people? And besides, as this letter says, Kennedy is very impressed, exact words, very impressed with Andropov. Not impressed with Reagan, very impressed with Andropov. So they argue here, Kennedy would go to Moscow and meet with the Soviet leadership. Even talks about bringing Senator Mark Hatfield, a liberal Republican, with him. They would talk to them. They would help arrange for a Soviet media tour in the United States. Basically a kind of a public relations tour in the United States. A kind of a PR campaign. Those are my words, PR campaign. To help communicate Soviet peaceful intentions. Andropov would come to the United States. So would high-level Soviet military and political officials would also come to the United States. They could talk directly to the American media, have sit-down interviews, and they even mentioned in here by name Walter Cronkite and Barbara Walters as 2 people that could do interviews with Andropov and some of these folks, right? And they could directly communicate to the American people. Now, what happened with all of this? By the way, and then it winds up in 1984, where it talks about the election campaign is coming up, and then there's a discussion as to Senator Kennedy's presidential prospects in the 1984 race. So it finishes up with that. Whatever became of this, remember this is May 1983. Well, Andropov eventually got sick at the end of that year, died, I believe it was in February 1984. They talked about this happening in September of 1983. Anybody remember your chronology of Cold War history? What happened over the Alaska territory in September 1983? The Soviets shot down the Korean airliner, killing 269 people, including 61 Americans. 007. And initially denied doing it. Initially did. So that kind of put an end to this, apparently. Not very impressive was all of that. Now for people who are listening or who are watching on C-SPAN and who are Democrats and who are angry about this and don't want to believe it because they like Kennedy and they didn't like Reagan, well, I've got news for you. Kennedy did a very, very, very similar thing to Jimmy Carter in March of 1980. And we know this from the Mitrokhin archives that came into the United States with Vasily Mitrokhin, a defector in 1992. Isn't it interesting that recently President Carter, when he was promoting his diaries, talked about how he believes Senator Kennedy had tried to undermine him on health care, right? Because of Kennedy was challenging Carter for the Democratic primary in 1980. Well, he didn't mention anything about this, but on March 5th, 1980, Kennedy again, through the same contact, the same liaison, in Moscow, had a message delivered to the Soviet leadership, to Leonid Brezhnev in this case. And as the Matrokin archives characterize this, here's what Kennedy was arguing. The Carter administration is trying to distort the peace-loving ideas behind Brezhnev's proposals. The atmosphere of tension and hostility is being fueled by Carter. The Carter White House, Zbigniew Brzezinski in particular, is feeding public opinion with nonsense about the Soviet military threat and Soviet ambitions for military expansion in the Persian Gulf, unquote. What's so jaw-dropping about this? According to this, Kennedy again is concerned about rising Soviet tensions, Cold War tensions, and he's blaming it not on the Soviets, but again on the president in the White House. Who was Jimmy Carter? We have Carter on the cover of the book kissing Brezhnev. I mean, Carter was anything but hard on the Soviets. He was very accommodating toward the Soviets. June 1979, Carter kisses Leonid Brezhnev at the Vienna summit. And then 6 months later, talk about betrayed with a kiss, Carter's in the White House celebrating Christmas and gets news in that the Red Army has just invaded Afghanistan. And then here, just 3 months after the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and Kennedy is concerned about the rising Cold War intentions, which according to the Matrokin archives are the fault of Carter? Wow. Wow. Put it in context. What was going on March 5th of 1980? Democratic presidential primaries, where Jimmy Carter, the incumbent Democratic president, was being challenged by Senator Ted Kennedy for that. So what happened in 1980 with Carter seems to have also happened to some extent in 1983 with Ronald Reagan as well, in both cases. Well, I could give other examples of this, but I'm watching the clock and I should probably stop, and I want to take your questions. But that was a look at Dewey, at Frank Marshall Davis, at Ted Kennedy, and there's a lot of other people I could cover as well. But I'll stop right there and take some of your questions. Thank you. Right here? Yeah. John?
What do you account for the growing support that the Communist Party has been giving the Democrats and its People's Weekly World and so forth? I mean, for crying out loud, in 2003, they had a MoveOn.org thing on their front homepage of their website, and more recently, they're constantly raving about President Obama's policies.
Yeah, it's a really remarkable thing. The One Nation rally that was held down here not that long ago, down here in D.C., I was shocked to see that when you went to the website that listed all the different endorsing groups, Communist Party USA was right there, right out in the open as one of the endorsers. And that is so, what's so interesting to me about that, having written a book on duping and how the communists duped liberals and progressives for 100 years, right, basically going back to the 1910s, is that in the past in those rallies, they would, the liberals like the plague would want the communists, they'd avoid them. And the only way that you would get Communist Party USA at those groups was secretly, covertly. And here in this case, it was kind of arms wide open, come on in, no problem. One of the most troubling examples I give in the book, this is one of those that I had to look at again, and I still look at the documents and just can't believe it, was an April 1941 group called the American Peace Mobilization. Okay, and this group was a communist front group. And by the way, people who are listening, who hate HUAC, right, the House Un-American Committee, this group was exposed by HUAC, which called it one of the most seditious, subversive communist front groups ever in the United States. This group accommodated Hitler, okay? So the House committee did far more good things than you guys are willing to acknowledge. But the American Peace Mobilization, their job was to toe the Soviet line, to represent Moscow's position, to try to bring progressives to their rally. They were created, think about this, August 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a pact, right? The Hitler-Stalin non-aggression pact, to not fight each other. So because of that, the American Communist movement in 1940 and 1941 protested American lend-lease to Britain, aiding Britain. Basically accommodated Hitler because Hitler was in an alliance with Stalin. And that group, the American Peace Mobilization, took that position. Communists, we have in the book the actual documents where the Comintern is ordering the creation of this group in Chicago in the fall of 1940. They went, they protested, they picketed outside the White House. FDR is a fascist. FDR is trying to start another war. Right? The Soviets don't send aid to Britain. Meanwhile, Britain's dying because of Hitler's blitzkrieg. That's the position they took. They picketed outside the White House. Washington Post covered it. New York Times covered it. They got all kinds of news. One of the leaders was Fred Field of the Vanderbilt Fortune, who was interviewed in one of the articles. The communist is never mentioned once. He was a communist. And they're picketing outside of the White House. And this is so incredible. On June 22nd, 1941, June 22nd, 1940, and I have the New York Times article that describes this. They put down their pickets and they started chanting a pro-war chant and went home. Anybody know what happened on June 22nd, 1941? The Soviet Union was invaded by Hitler's Germany. Hitler and the Germans betrayed the Hitler-Stalin pact. On a dime, overnight, the people in the American Peace Mobilization became pro-war. And they changed, this is so cynical, they changed their name from American Peace Mobilization to the American People's Mobilization. They didn't even change the acronym. They kept the acronym APM. And they started pushing vigorously for Lend-Lease, for aid to Britain, for the United States to enter the war. FDR was no longer a fascist. You know, now they could be, CPUSA could, now they could be pro-American, right? Because now America would be allied with Stalin. So it was really a great day for them. The New York Times article on the subject is titled, "Clergyman Group Opposes War Aid." That's the American Peace Mobilization. Clergyman group. Because of the presence of religious left social justice duped progressive pastors. The communists would show up at these rallies and say, "Blessed are the peacemakers," right? "Turn the other cheek." Of course, not noting that they're communists and they're blowing up churches and throwing nuns in the gulag and jailing priests. And far too many people, especially on the religious left. Herb Romerstein, the great ex-communist himself and an investigator of this period, I asked him when I started doing this book, I said, was there a particular group that was duped more than any other? And he said, yes, progressive pastors. They were the biggest suckers of them all. And American Peace Mobilization is a good example of that. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you need a microphone?
Al Milliken, AM Media. In your analysis, how distorted historically and how effective as propaganda do you see the way Hollywood, through films, have depicted the communist influence, in particularly, I guess, in the U.S.?
Yeah, great question. It's scandalous. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And I would say that Hollywood, they are still dupes for the communists, because in the grave, the communists are in the grave now, and Hollywood is still protecting them. Protecting them as if they were never communist to begin with. I mean, here you had October 1947, and these Hollywood 10 figures who were almost all party members, we now know. They're called to Washington to testify, and they get a group of liberal Hollywood actors and actresses who they lied to and told them, we're liberals and progressives just like you, we're not communists. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall. Humphrey Bogart said, we checked every member of our group before we left to make sure that there were no pinks or no reds anywhere. They're very, very careful about this. And there seems to be no sympathy among the left for the fact that the communists lied to the liberals on the left and tarnished their reputations. No problem with any of that. No problem whatsoever. So they create this group called the Committee for the First Amendment. These Hollywood liberals did. And they flew to Washington. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Danny Kaye, Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, Katharine Hepburn. People were duped really, really, really bad. Really bad. The Daily Worker, they're on the cover of the Daily Worker almost every issue. Crusaders for the First Amendment. Here they are. And then they get to Washington, and John Howard Lawson and Dalton Trumbo and some of these other people are called up on the stand, and boy, big surprise, Congress actually has some evidence. They don't just, they're not just a bunch of red baiters who are just bringing people, they bring them up there and, John Howard Lawson, here's all the different communist front groups that you were a member of. Here's the article you wrote for Masses and Mainstream. Here's the article you wrote for Daily Worker. Here's this, here's that. Here's your Communist Party card number, 5-digit. And they present all this evidence. And Lawson and Trumbo, you know what they did? They stood up. Fascist! Nazi! American concentration camp! They'd be let out by police. They did what the left always does. When they're nailed, when they're caught, and when these guys were caught as being communists, they called their accusers Nazis and fascists. And then they were taken out, and then Bogart and all these folks said, oh boy, were we duped. Wow, were we lied to. Lauren Bacall. By the way, the airplane that they got on in Los Angeles was called the Red Star. And Lauren Bacall said, right away, I should have just thought, oh no. But no concern at all for the, and now this whole era is portrayed as Joe McCarthy on a wild rampage, witch hunter, persecuting all these poor people in Hollywood. Joe McCarthy wasn't even on the House Committee on Un-American Activities in October 1947. He was a senator. He had nothing to do with this. But every new anti-communist was portrayed as a Joe McCarthy. I quote one of the co-founders of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin was one of the founders. By the way, read Roger Baldwin, ACLU founder's 1928 book, Liberty Under the Soviets. Liberty Under the Soviets. But one of the founders was Harry Ward, who was a Methodist minister. And I quote a piece that Harry Ward wrote for, I think it was Protestant Digest in 1940 or 1941. And he's warning, here a full decade and a half before Joe McCarthy, he's warning about the next Red Scare. First it was Alexander Mitchell Palmer and Woodrow Wilson. By the way, both Democrats. Then it was Martin Dies of Texas, Democrat. Then it was this guy, and now it's this guy. So Joe McCarthy, they would have found their Joe McCarthy in any event. And that's not to defend any of McCarthy's excesses, please. But we now have the evidence of how many of these people were guilty and the way they lied and misled people. And it's very disturbing. Other questions right there? Yes.
I wonder if you have any comment on the role of American corporations as dupes for America's foes, such as Henry Ford and the Ford Corporation, and also
Arm & Hammer.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And also now that the flow of corporate money into elections has become, the floodgates have been opened. If you have any concern about American companies that want to do business with communist countries like China, either selling them products or buying raw materials from them, using their influence on American politicians, which is only going to grow, to force American policy in a direction that is more sympathetic to communist China and less sympathetic to the American worker.
Yeah. Well, I'll cut you off because I haven't looked into it. I really haven't looked into it. I didn't find much in corporate, although Arm & Hammer was originally on my list, and I eventually, I'm serious when I say this could be a multi-volume set. I mean, I'm telling you, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, so many different people were manipulated, but no, I didn't look in any particular corporations. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, I was just wondering what where the American Socialist Party plays into the narrative with politicians like Al Smith. Were they easily duped to, or were they sympathetic to the Communist Party?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. In fact, I have in the book a really interesting document I found in the archives, Comintern archives, from the 1932 presidential campaign, where Communist Party USA was just torching everybody. I mean, they hated the Republicans, they hated FDR, they hated the socialists. I mean, you know, they were going after everybody. I mean, it's amazing too the anger that was there among American communists. I was really surprised by that. When you would see these documents, the fights that they had among each other, and so-and-so, fraud, exposing daily worker as a stool pigeon. You know, that would be the order from the latest meeting minutes. So they, but yeah, that, and also I would update this. In fact, John, to connect this to John's earlier question about modern day progressives, one of the groups that I looked at that just came up 2007, 2008 was the group Progressives for Obama. And it's really starting to now cloud this whole progressive liberal thing. I've always understood progressives and liberals to be on the left, but not on the communist left, right? I mean, there's these variations. There's this full spectrum of beliefs. You got the very far left Marxist-Leninists over there, and then you start to move over a little bit, maybe democratic socialism, you know, maybe liberal. But this group, Progressives for Obama, one of the four initiators was Tom Hayden, a founder of SDS, who wrote the Port Huron Statement. One of the 94 signers was Jane Fonda. Of course, you know what happened in Vietnam. Mark Rudd, who was with SDS in Colombia, was one of the 94 signers. I mean, a lot of these people, they weren't just student radicals, anti-war in the 60s. They were communists, right? They were followers of Che or Fidel. Or Mark Rudd in his book, Underground, says that Michael Klonsky was an actual Stalinist. Rudd wasn't a Stalinist. But it's amazing how many of these people, one, are now in academia, for one thing, but that they're now out calling themselves Progressives for Obama. And so what do they really believe? Are they now just lifting the progressive label? Have they changed their views? It's hard to say. I quote in the book a fascinating assessment from Mark Rudd of the 2008 election, where Rudd says, you know, Obama, he did it. He did it. He didn't blow it. He said just the right things and took the right policy positions to be able to attract just enough moderates and independents and crossover voters. He didn't blow it. He did it. He said, and I agree with this strategy. Any other strategy in this political environment invites sure defeat. Obama did it. And it's fascinating that for Rudd and some of these folks, Obama's the first Democratic Party presidential nominee they've ever supported. I mean, they hated Jack Kennedy. They hated LBJ. They dismissed Carter as a born-again buffoon. That's the language that some of these people use. So they see in Obama somebody who's far enough to the left for them. It's interesting. It's very, very telling. And Rudd's point, after the November 4th, 2008 elections, I do what I always do on a Wednesday morning before I go to class. I got the printout of the latest exit poll data to see how Americans, how they voted and how they self-identify. And every single one of these, this has been going on for 20 years now, the American public has described itself as conservative over liberal by 40 to 20%. In fact, Gallup did a huge poll summer 2009, 40 to 20%. It's always 40 to 20. By the way, academia is 90 to 10 liberal to conservative, and they preach diversity, okay? But it's been 40-20, and with the election of Obama, who National Journal had called in 2007 the most liberal member of the Senate, to the left of Barbara Boxer, Ted Kennedy, Hillary Clinton, you name it. So I'm thinking when I woke up the morning of Wednesday, November 2008, Okay, I'm finally going to see a change. It's going to be 40% liberal, 20%, because it's got to be, right? 40-20 again. So you had this incredible situation where a self-identifying and self-professing conservative electorate by a margin of 2-1 goes in and decisively votes for president, a man the National Journal ranked the most liberal member of the Senate in 2007. It's quite unprecedented. And how did that happen? Well, you got to go into the reasons why Bush lost, why people didn't like Bush, or why John McCain lost. In many ways, a vote against McCain was a vote against Bush. I think a lot of people, too, were taken by this concept of change. What does change mean? But the progressives for Obama people, man, they were thrilled with this. The American public finally voted the way that Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda and Mark Rudd and these folks have wanted them to vote. The same people who, by the way, in 1968 targeted the Democratic National Convention, not the Republican, the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Democrats, liberals, the communists are not your friends. Quit defending them. But as James Burnham said, right? For the left, the preferred enemy is always to the right. So it's the anti-communists that consume their outrage more than the pro-communists. It's not that they're pro-communists, but anti-communists are Neanderthals. I don't like them. One more, sure. It's not that they actually think Joe Stalin is worse than Joe McCarthy, but in their lectures, they complain about Joe McCarthy and not Joe Stalin. Hi.
Hi. I'll be very short. I'll tell that I'm coming from a country that lived, we overcame Soviets, distorted. I'm coming from Lithuania. Nobody has any communist sentiments except the communists themselves. So for me, it's stunning. I worked in a Hoover archives and found some interesting material. For me, it's not just stunning, but shocking to see a young person in the United States holding the slogan saying socialism is an alternative. Yes. But on the other hand, I can see Angela Davis, who was darling of Soviet KGB, still teaching. Yes. So I'm just so stunned, how can that be possible? And I also can tell that Russia today, probably the Russian propaganda channel in English, they have like 500 people right now working in DC. They run 12 minutes interview with the current American Communist Party chairman who was promising revolution to come in the U.S. 12 minutes on a prime time. So they're still doing. So I'm grateful for you, and I hope you can re-brainwash those young people who were so de-brainwashed. Yes. The young people who were so badly brainwashed.
Well, thank you. And Lee Edwards is here. His group, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Google Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Great website, and they're helping to educate people on this as well. But the problem is that we're not learning this past. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I did a review of about 20 high school civics texts a few years back, and they're basically the main 20 that are used across the United States. I did it for the state of Wisconsin. But it's incredible. In fact, this was right about the time, this was 3 or 4 years after the seminal book by Harvard University Press, the Black Book of Communism, had come out, which documented 100 million dead under communist governments. I couldn't find that figure in a single textbook. Not one. I couldn't find any figures at all. None whatsoever. I mean, 100 million dead, and by the way, the Black Book of Communism only has about 25 million dead for the Soviet Union, when in fact it's probably 60 to 70 million. Alexander Yakovlev, his Yale University Press book, he was one of Gorbachev's principal reformers, and he was tasked with the duty of trying to figure out how many victims, how many people actually were killed by the communists. Yakovlev says 60 to 70 million killed under Stalin alone. Alexander Solzhenitsyn used numbers like that. And we know that Mao probably killed about 70 million. So really, the number is probably not 100 million, it's probably about 140 million when you really go up there. But as a conservative figure, it's at least 100 million. these numbers start to run together. Just think about this. Take all the dead in World War I, which was the most destructive war in history up to that point. Take all the dead in World War II, combine them, World War I and World War II, combine them, double them, and only then are you approaching the number of dead victims of communism. Everybody in here has an uncle who died in World War II. About 300,000 Americans died in World War II. The communists killed over 100 million people, over 100 million people. And it's something that we don't even know about. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, just go to Marxist.org. Boy, I shouldn't give an endorsement for Marxist.org. But it's free. It's free. Buy it online. I hate this nonsense that I hear all the time. I get called by students at other universities other than Grove City College who say, can you please come here and give a talk on why communism is bad? Okay, because we don't know. We don't have any idea. And I get up there and you hear again and again, well, but Stalin and these guys were an aberration. I mean, they did, communism is really a good idea if you read it in theory. No, read the Communist Manifesto. It's like 50 pages long. You can read it in 2 hours. It's a horrible book. Read Marx's 10-point plan. Read the one little paragraph that says, Marx wrote, right, the entire theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence. Abolition of private property. My 3-year-old daughter can tell you that you're going to have to kill people if you do that. Okay? Abolition of private property, that's a good idea? I mean, that's craziness. I could look at that right there in 1850 and say, you know how many people are going to have to die? You're going to have to kill to pull that off? Not a good idea in theory, which is why almost everywhere that it's been tried, anywhere on the planet, whether in Asia or Africa or Latin America or Eastern Europe, wherever, widespread bloodshed and tragedy, again and again and again. Martin Malya, the professor at University of California, Berkeley, says that in each of these cases, too, in each of these countries where communism has been tried, the massive annihilation of human beings and repression and basic crimes and carnage far outdid anything in the previous experience or nationality or history of any of these countries. All right, this was an entirely new thing. Whether it's in Cambodia or the Soviet Union or China or Cuba, whatever, you name it, again and again and again. And we're not learning any of it. And the reason why is the wretched, wretched state of our universities that are not teaching this stuff, that are horribly biased, that do not believe in ideological diversity at all, and by the way, are way overpriced while we're at it. I'll stop there. How's that?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kengor, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you already have a copy of Dupes, you're welcome to come up to the stage. I know Dr. Kengor would be delighted to sign. And if you haven't picked up your copy yet, we have them available outside for purchase. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again at Heritage.